Good evening, everybody, or good morning, as the case may be for me here in Melbourne. My name is Jeff Garmany. I am a senior lecturer of Latin American Studies in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. As is customary in Australia, I'd actually like to start with a recognition of country. This is to say I would like to acknowledge the traditional landowners of the land upon which I work and live, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, this is the second seminar in the Illicit Economies, Violence and Development series. This event is co-convened between the Center for the Study of Illicit Economies, Violence and Development at SOAS and the Royal United Services Institute. Before we get started, I just want to take care of a couple issues of housekeeping. First is that this session is being recorded, so please be aware of that. And please also turn off your camera and your microphone, particularly while Jenny is giving her talk. Please also select speaker view in order to get the best view of the presentation. So to give you some background here, this is the second seminar in a 6-part series, Illicit Economies, Violence and Development. The purpose of this series is to explore points of connection between illicit economies, violence in its many forms, and contemporary development landscapes. To break this down a little bit further, when we talk about illicit economies, we're of course talking about well-known examples like drug economies, human trafficking, illegal resource extraction, but we're also talking about the illicit trade of licit commodities as well. That's an important side of this. Now, this sort of analysis is important for those who are trying to understand contemporary development and production of wealth and also inequality. And difficult as it may be to study these sorts of issues, illicit economies and violence are crucial parts of development, yet they're often overlooked and unaccounted for. And we'll explore some of those reasons for why that is today. Related to this seminar also explores the geographies of these processes, which is to say not only where these sorts of things happen, which of course is often sort of borderlands or frontier lands, but also the types of spaces they produce, which again may be borderlands or frontier lands, but also, for example, the state and state spaces and spaces of capital accumulation, which again are some of the themes that we'll explore today. So to briefly recap, this session or this series really has sort of two general goals. On the one hand, we ask how illicit economies are connected to broader networks of development and state building and how violence is embedded in these networks. And on the other hand, we ask how policies and interventions would seek to manage illicit economies and illicit flows might actually impact development. The audience for this session, of course, is a very broad one, and we're hoping to engage with academics, with students, with researchers, with practitioners, with policymakers, and any other members of the general public who might be interested in these sorts of issues. The last session, which convened on 20 October, I believe, focused specifically on frontiers, illicit flows, and the geographies of uneven development. That session was led by Jonathan Goodend, who was one of the principal organizers of this series, and it involved a series of questions and answers with Michael Watts from the University of California, Berkeley, and my colleague Dali Kikon at the University of Melbourne. That session was recorded and it's available on YouTube. And if you're interested in watching it, actually, that link is available on the same page where you would have registered for this session today. And you can go back and find that, as will the recorded link for this session be available there as well. Now, today's session follows a slightly different format. Today, we have a keynote speaker, Jenny Pearce, whom I'll introduce in a moment here. And the session today focuses on illicit economies, violences, and state formation, specifically in Latin America. And before I introduce Jenny, I just want to take care of a few final bits of housekeeping. And the first is, again, please remember to keep your microphone muted, particularly while Jenny is talking. Now, Jenny's presentation will run for 45 to 50 minutes, and there will be time for Q&A afterwards. So in other words, please don't interrupt her. That said, her presentation will be divided into 3 blocks, and she'll ask each of us at the end of each of those 3 blocks to take 1 to 2 minutes just to reflect on what she's talked about and to make some notes to ourselves. This isn't to say that this is not a formal question and answer period, so you're not expected to sort of type in your questions at that moment. You can put them in the chat if you want to, but this is really just sort of intended as a period of self-reflection where you can make some notes to yourself, and it gives everyone, probably Jenny included, a moment just to organize their thoughts. Then at the end of her talk, we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. At that time, I'll ask you to either put your question in the chat and I can read your question aloud, or if you'd like, you can, again, sort of send me a message in the chat or raise your hand using the sort of the emoji feature in Zoom, and we can call on you and unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself. But again, please recognize that there will be plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. So please don't try to interrupt Jenny in the middle of her talk. So I believe that covers all the sort of the nuts and bolts, so to speak, and I'll go ahead and move on now to introduce our speaker today. So Jenny Pearce is research professor in the Latin American and Caribbean Center at the London School of Economics. She's a political scientist whose work engages anthropological and participatory research methods on social change, violence, security, power, and participation. She's conducted fieldwork since the 1980s in Colombia, Central America, Mexico, Chile, Brazil, and Venezuela. She considers herself a peace scholar and is committed to, in addition to empirical study, theoretical development in the field of peace, power, and violence. She's very well known in her field and published widely, and her latest book came out in 2020 and is titled Politics Without Violence, with a question mark, Towards a Post-Barbarian Enlightenment. And I believe she will talk some about this book today. And our talk today focuses specifically on her research experience in Latin America, considering themes of violence in its many forms, the ways illicit economies are growing and mutating, and points of connection between state formation and the ways the state reproduces crime in all sorts of ways. So with no further ado, I shall now hand over to Jenny, and we thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to CIVAD and thank you to RUSI for this wonderful opportunity to discuss with a wide audience and bring Latin America perhaps into a debate. Latin America isn't always there. And I've started off with this photo. I wouldn't normally put myself in a photo to start a lecture, but the reason I've done this is because it's so pertinent to what I'm going to be talking about. It's because this is a photo I was with young guys in Guadalupe, in Nuevo León, in Mexico. And they said to me, here, you live or you die. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about, right, is about how young people get to that point. And I'm actually speaking from Santa Marta, Magdalena, the coast in Colombia. And it's rather extraordinary because this is where the marijuana boom began, way back in the 60s. And so in a way, it's a place which has so much connection also to the topic. And I've actually just come back from Tierra Caliente and in Mexico and various places. I'm going to talk about that. So it connects very much where I am now, Tierra Caliente, where all sorts of battles, they are battles, in between periods of dense calm, as the bishop explained to me, he thinks the situations at the moment. But there, the issue of mutating criminalities, mutating in different illicit economies is absolutely crucial to what's going on in Mexico today. So that's a broad sort of introduction. Right, next slide. So I want to give you the arguments that I'm trying to kind of put forward through the structure, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. So I want to start off by putting violence in the center, because violence is so often put in the background, and I want to put it into the foreground, because I actually think that violence and criminalities are not the same. It takes some time, for instance, for some violences to become crimes. I'm thinking in my lifetime how it was perfectly acceptable for a man to rape his wife in the home. It was the private space, and that is now a crime. And so there are some issues we need to think about what we understand by violence and what we understand by crime. And then, of course, crime can also involve the containment of violences. And that's a tough subject I will get to. And so there's a great deal to talk about in terms of this relationship. And what I want to highlight in Latin America is what I call the chronification of violence. So this is a process by which violence has become diffused by the state, I would argue, as much as by the rise of illicit economies, in what is the most unequal region in the world. So this idea of chronic violence and its chronification is where I want to sort of start this discussion. Illicit economies have then taken root and mutated into multiple forms. How on earth do we explain this? And this rooting and mutation connects to long-term processes of state formation. So politics has evolved in this region in a way in which elites have failed to invest in the rule of law. And I argue that states reproduce violences through security policies and the institutions which implement them. So politics in this region is highly transactional. It is highly about what I will give you if you give me your vote. And there are obviously much other aspects of the electoral ones of that exchange. And to understand that transactionality implies understanding state formation. And illicit economies have played a real role in financing the politics of the region. And I don't think until we get to grips with that transactional relationship will we actually get to grips with illicit economies and with violence, although obviously there are some steps we can take in terms of rethinking the whole drugs issue. So that's it, rethinking our understanding of illicit economies, states and violences. Unlike the Middle East, it's important to take note, Latin, and I'm sure everyone listening here will know this, Latin America is not at war. However, we don't even have a name for the non-war violences, which actually, I think, challenge our understanding of what we mean by peace as much as if the region was at war. Next slide. So this is how I want to structure. So as Jeff said, I want to do it in blocks because to listen to 45 minutes is not easy. There's a little 2-minute break between blocks, not enough to go make yourself some coffee, I'm afraid. But the idea is to think about all the different sections. So block 1, chronic violence and the sources of chronification. Block 2, the political economy of illicit economies in Latin America. Block 3, the violence reproducing state, elites and transactional political orders. And then a conclusion. What can we learn about illicit economies, the state and violences from Latin America, and how do we reset the conversation on drugs, orders and disorders? And on disorders, I'm very much influenced by the Drugs and Disorder Project of SOAS. So I was privileged to be the chair of the International Advisory Board, and that notion of disorders and what we mean by order has really, I think, become a very important way of trying to understand what's going on in the region. Next slide. So this first block, the chronification of violence, I am assuming that not everybody here knows Latin America. And so I wanted to kind of visualize some of the violences that I have known in my history of working in this region from actually the first period of work I did was in the 1970s and in the southern cone of Latin America. Next slide. And I need to understand and discuss with you what is violence, because if I'm talking about the chronification of violence, we need to have at least a thinking tool. So the book that Jeff mentioned, next slide, led me to a thinking tool, right? So I had an interdisciplinary conversation, and that's the only way I think we can get to understand violence, through with biologists, a conversation that would not have been possible a few decades ago, a social scientist and a biologist. But biologists today have an extremely sophisticated understanding that the biological body is a social body. It is co-constructed through the relationships that we build with each other. And that includes then the relationships in all the spaces of socialization up until the construction of the nation state itself. So I also discussed through literature with psychologists, with natural scientists, with historians, anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, very much philosophers, and in order to reach a thinking tool, and I put it in that way, it is not a definition. It is really to get us thinking about this phenomenon of violence, which has multiple expressions, and to try and see whether we can engage with it in a way we don't really want to. My argument is we don't want to face up to violence. So that word, Etienne Balibar sort of said, facing up to violence is so difficult for humanity. And which is why we put it in the background, or we have forms of entertainment that actually sort of distance ourselves from the violences that we live in. But I think because of the role violence is now playing in politics, it is very important to understand what is that violence. What do we mean when we talk about violence? So this thinking tool, I suggest that violence is meaning-led and meaning-generating. That for me is incredibly important, that we as human beings, one of the things that stands out is that we do invest meanings in things we do. And so meaning-laden, meaning-generating acts, physical acts, but also actions of somatic harm on the body. Actions which can be actions over time that can end up being understood as structural, as symbolic, as Bourdieu says. For me, it's important to kind of put that issue of the body into the discussion. And for instance, a child who dies of malnutrition at 5, avoidably, for me, that the body has been impacted of that child, and it's actions over time that lead to that death. But I don't sort of just throw out structural violence, because I'm really, really concerned that we put the actual harm on the body, the traumas that emerge and cross and reproduce through generations. That for me is incredibly important. And then the other aspect of this thinking tool is that this meaning generating, meaning laden acts, these acts and actions potentially constitute, normalize and or destroy social orders. And that links very much with trying to discuss what are the social orders and the political orders around them that actually are imbued with violence, and how do we explain this in the Latin American context. So now we go to the next slide. I'll begin to sort of go back in time for me to try and just sort of get us thinking about the varied violences in Latin America through the lens through which we think violence. So political violence has been an absolutely huge phenomenon here, and it hasn't ended. There is still political violence. It is still extraordinarily dangerous to be a politician in Mexico, right? But here is the political violence that I began with. You know, this is Pinochet in Chile, and obviously before that we have the emergence of insurgent violence, and Che Guevara had a big influence on the region. But the reaction of the right here, supported by the United States, was vicious. I can only say that. And the disappearances, the pictures, these photographs I've lived with since the 1970s of the thousands of people who disappeared under the dictatorship. And that idea of violence to disappear the body is so significant, because today in Latin America, where I've just been in Mexico, disappearance remains a phenomenon. And basically the goal is that you disappear the body so that you affect not just the person who dies, but you affect all their family. You send messages to the family, to everyone around. Next slide. War violences. There have been wars, civil wars in Latin America, and I lived this one in El Salvador. And this is a violence that people will just been in a meeting just here in Santa Marta, where they've said, well, Latin America doesn't engage in war between states. But these wars in which you have insurgent violences, but state violences against those insurgents, which end up massacring civilians. This is has been a horror in the history of some of the countries of this region, not all, but certainly El Salvador, the one I lived, was an extraordinary example of this, and the planes that bombed were provided by the United States. Next slide. And this is a more difficult discussion, right? So there we have on the one side the FARC, and then above you can see ELN, and then below them the Clan del Golfo. Are all these forms of insurgent collective violence is the same? No, they are not the same. They are quite complex phenomena. So this is Colombia, where I am at the moment, and where there's been a peace process with the FARC. This has not stopped the violences for various reasons, which I won't have time to go into at the moment. But I just wanted to sort of make the point that the FARC started off as, from the Communist Party influence, had a huge base in the peasant communities that had lost land because of the vast concentration of land in this country. It still is one of the most unequal land ownership contexts in the world. And the FARC started off a very political organization. In the 1980s, it opted to go into, at the time, they taxed the coca growers, but they went from that into laboratories, and now post-peace process, there is a section that is heavily embedded in drug trafficking, and there was some of that before as well, but that has led to dissidents, those who have not accepted demobilisation, but they've also not accepted because the way the state handled the programs that wrote for the peace process was not very good, to say the least. And the ELN has also, as an organisation, they avoided going into drug trafficking totally. They did kidnapping, and they did blow up oil pipelines and extort oil companies, but again, an organisation that has changed enormously, and now the ELN, where there's going to be a potential peace discussion in Havana very shortly. This is an organisation that has actually still remained in arms and has gone into the drugs. And then Plan de Golfo. This was a group that was very linked. Next slide, please. To a paramilitary group. Okay, paramilitaries. What are paramilitaries? Self-defense groups. These are also where I've just been in Michoacan. Self-defense groups emerged outside the states to deal with a drug trafficking group, the Templarios. Now, paramilitary, the history of paramilitary, however, is not, they had nothing to do with the state and nothing to do with the elites. They actually were very much connected to cattle ranchers and other elites who supported the idea that you needed a paramilitary army to actually deal with the growth force, and the paramilitary were deeply involved in drug trafficking. And the point I'm trying to make with these slides, and again, I mean, I can only just get us thinking, is, are these criminal groups, political groups, a mixture of the two? How do we understand and analyse these? Because they are, at the end, deeply imbued in various political contexts with political goals, like the FARC originally, but those goals then dissipate. But big question is, are they still political groups? It's going to be a very important issue because the new president here in Colombia wants to promote total peace, in which some groups will say, no, we want to be considered political. Others, if they're not considered political, then they have to go through to the justice system. So big issues, but the mixture and the complexity is something we have to get our heads around in order to really understand what is going on. Next slide. This is another kind of violence in the region, which I've known very, very closely, which is Medellin, the urban violences, where we've had, everyone probably has seen Narcos, so you will know all about the history of Pablo Escobar, although this comuna, as they called in Medellin, back in the 80s, this was a place where people had come from rural areas fleeing the violencia period in Colombian history, and they'd come here, they'd had to build their own houses, try and get electricity, done it all themselves, and then they needed defense and protection. At the same time as all that was going on, I was with the group from this comuna who were building their own idea of what development is. They called it realizadores de los sueños. We are realizers of our own dreams. But this is an area where various groups fought over the key trafficking route and route for arms, route for other goods that this comuna from above connects with places like Urabá and other frontier regions. And here the battles were with so many different groups. I've been there so often with different kinds of groups. You know, the FARC took control here, then the government came in, La Operación Orión, and they allied with paramilitaries. There was a horrific disappearance, some 300 bodies reputedly buried at the top. And there's a whole discussion now about, although there was a social urbanism program here, which built an escalator, which has been widely revered, and even people there do like it because it connects them and makes them feel citizens. But the combos, the gangs, other forms of violence and criminality still thrive. And so it raises lots of questions about the urban violences in Latin America. And I could have used pictures from favelas of Rio. I could have used pictures from all kinds of places in Latin America to illustrate this. Next slide. And so there's been a kind of interesting rethinking before I go to my next photographs, which we need to discuss. It's for discussion, right? So because the terminology needs discussing. So, but one thing we do know is the levels of deaths in wars, right? Actually, we don't look at the fact that the levels of death, and here they call it through organised crime, is as high, right? And that's in that period 2000 to 2017, which makes us think about these, and I'm going to question the issue of homicides as the only measure and what we understand by that. But I think the point is we can't just look at war violences anymore. We have to look at these other violences. And that is what Latin America puts on the table, but I don't think the Latin American region is the only region where this is an issue. Next slide. So I can't bring in the rise of drug trafficking elsewhere and its impacts. We know about Colombia, the first series of Narcos, and then we got to the second series. But let's look at it from what goes on the ground. And I was 6 minutes away from when the Zetas set fire to the casino one afternoon in Monterrey, Nuevo León, and killed some over 50 women, because it was women that play on the gambling machines in the afternoon. Very near to Monterrey is San Pedro Garza, it's part of Nuevo León, and that's where the municipality is the richest per capita of Latin America. And when I had arrived, one other visit to this region, when they had just arrested Trevino, the founder of the Zetas, or one of the leaders of the Zetas at the time, I went to San Pedro Garza to do what I call narcoturismo, drugs tourism, and to find out how he lived. And he lived side by side by the richest. His favourite fashion garment was from Louis Vuitton. So what is it the drug traffickers aspire to? What is it that they are trying to be? Are they trying to sort of enter the world of the powerful? What is the accumulation? And we will talk about the fact we have to sort of, that's one point of the chain, only one point, but it's an important one in Latin America. Next slide. Now, big battles with cartels. So again, this has evolved. And I think the important thing is, I think I have another slide where I'll make the same point, but it's worth putting here, that the reality escapes our capacity as researchers to conceptualize it. So now we have in Mexico 7 cartels at least, and lots of other smaller groups. The Jalisco now have these, in Michoacan where I've just been, they have these, there's monsters, as they're called, monsters, tanks that have been adapted. They use drones. So that sophistication of the technology in these non-war violences is a real issue in Mexico at the moment. Next slide. But I want to now get us thinking about other kinds of violences. I want to get us thinking about the fact that it's not just those violences. Here we have feminicides, we have indigenous communities that have been really badly oppressed, manipulated, everything. These are women who can't give birth in their own village, they have to walk for miles. And 95% of the feminicides in Mexico are impugned. They are not dealt with in the courts. Next slide. I need to rush here because I just looked at the time, so I've got a lot to talk about. This is the violence of the state. Black lives in the favelas of Rio Mata. This is the violence of the state against the protesters. And this is the way Bukele at this moment in El Salvador is treating the gangs. It is a violence of the state to treat gangs, and he's sending the army to just take them off the streets. If you've just got a tattoo, you can be a gang member, and he's thousands and thousands. He's gaining a lot of political popularity through this. So it's another link of all these issues to politics. Next slide. And this is where I've just been as well, which is another form of state violence and state guardias blancas, white guards of the ranches of Chiapas. And this, they were commemorating when I was just there in Actiala massacre in 1997. And this sculpture, if you can see clearly the faces, you will see that this is an incredible experience for the indigenous communities of this area of Actiala. And these group I was with, Las Abejas, they're called, they're a pacifist group, they're a peace, they want peace. And so we've got another violence here, and the trauma of this particular massacre still lives on. Next slide. So, chronification of violence. I'll get through this in some hopefully 5 minutes, and then you can have a break to think about things. We could measure in homicides, but I talked earlier about disappearances, where you can't count the body. And that's why disappearances take place, because you can't measure this, you don't know. but the impact of the families, the impact on society is enormous. And so for me, the measurement in homicides, which we know so well, it's useful because you can make a broad comparison between how many murders per 100,000 and places compete. But for me, it's worrying because the competition to lower the homicides, I saw that in Medellin with the combos, where, and I asked, well, what's going on here? They say you have to ask permission to kill, because they knew that the municipality of Medellin did not want to be in the highest homicide rate cities of the world. And so now they get on with extorting, selling the virginity of young girls. And so all sorts of other violences take place. Gender violence is only recently have we begun to actually talk about feminicides and but all the other violences that take place. We can measure all these things against children, youth violence, prison violence, political violence, we could measure state violence. So for me, I'm trying to say, could we find another measure than just homicides that gives us this broader understanding of the violences that are going on? And I call this process of chronification. Next slide. And rather than a statistic, I just want to tell a story of how all these violences connect. So a young woman told us took a long time for her to speak. She'd had to flee from her house where her partner had beaten her up. She fled with her baby. She wanted to go to the police and asked her mother to accompany her. Her mother didn't trust the police, so she went on her own. The policeman she met took a liking to her, said, "Oh, we're going to visit you in your house." He arrives at her house, and the local gang of the neighbourhood kills the policeman. And then all the officers come, destroy the house of her mother where she'd gone to stay. All of those, the violence in the intimate space, the violence of the institutions of the state, the violence of the street, all those violences are there present, and they reproduce through all the spaces of socialization. Next slide. So we can measure chronic violence by intensity, homicides, but also the non-lethal violences, by space, by the way violence reproduces across space, from the internet, the street, the school, the prison, politics, and the state. All those violences, all those spaces matters, and by temporality. So this reproduction over time, and that's how I understand chronic violence. Next slide. And then just to give it a statistical. Sad statistical though as well, because I just consulted this most recent report from UNICEF. 1 in 10 deaths in Latin America of children and adolescents are the result of homicide. Homicide, the leading cause of death among adolescents, 10 to 19. The 5 countries with the highest rates of homicide amongst children and adolescents worldwide are in Latin America. 2 out of 3 children in Latin America experience violence at home. For me, if we're going to talk about illicit economies, we're going to talk about the state, we have to talk about this, because we have to talk about how illicit economies add to the chronification of violence, but also how the state does. Next slide. Right, so here is your 2 minutes. And the idea is to think a little bit about anything that came to your mind while I talked, and anything questions you have, any disagreements, because this is a discussion, it's a debate. But I'm trying to put out there something which I hope will be relevant to other places in the world. I think it is, which is how do we actually understand violence? What are we measuring when we talk about homicides? And what are we not measuring and not seeing? And what questions are we not asking? So I'll give you 2 minutes. One minute more. Okay, I think that's it. So I hope I managed to sort of, have a bit of a breathing space there. Next slide and next block. So now to take us into a bit more analytical in the sense of where does the violence connect to the political economy of illicit economies in Latin America. Next slide. So here I want to deal with three issues. First of all, how do we conceptualize criminal disorders? I'm here taking from the SOAS project on drugs and disorders. How do we conceptualize these orders in Latin America? And then secondly, the economic, social, political, territorial frontier logics of criminality. And then I've just literally suddenly come back from Tierra Caliente, Michoacán, Mexico, and I want to just talk about what I lived there because it was an incredible experience and in the heartlands of some of the more difficult aspects of the problematic we're discussing. Next slide. So there have been various discussions in the literature about how to do this. It's become a richer discussion than in the last, I would say, 5 years than it ever was in the past, because we're beginning to try to connect with the problematic of both of criminality, but and what role violence plays in it, and how we understand this. So we have the kind of very interesting work of criminal governance, Desmond Arias and Bennett Lessing, and so this idea is to draw attention to how increasingly in Latin America there are territories, places, which basically are in some way governed by criminal groups, and in a way that suggests that they are replacing something of state role. And I think they've added a lot to the discussion. I'm a little bit reticent to use the word governance, I have to admit, because in the post-Cold War, we used a lot the term governance to talk about different forms and different actors that could be kind of involved in governance, such as civil society. And I just worry we forget the violence when we talk about governance, but the literature is brilliant, so it's very worth reading. And then we have Nicholas Barnes's work. He's come to talk about criminal politics. And he's kind of given us a new or an additional sort of focus on this notion, in which he's really trying to get to grips with whether or not these criminal groups are actually in some way forming the state, or what is their relationship to the state processes and the state process, but also politics in general, because I haven't got their reference here, but Guillermo Trejo and Sanley have done a wonderful book on Mexico, and they've actually shown so clearly how the electoral politics of Mexico has been influenced by the particular way the drugs process has illicit economies have developed in the country, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. But and then in the a researcher who's working with us on a research project we have in Mexico, a historian, he suggested, we talked on the bus down to Michoacán just now, and that's where he said, oh, criminal feudalism, because he wanted to give an idea of the fact that these are a kind of people are getting something potentially from accepting the criminal people that are running their communities, at the same time as they're also being threatened, and there's a kind of criminal overlordship. And so all of these ideas try to capture places and spaces, not everywhere. And that's, again, a big point we're going to have to make, right? How far can we generalize? These are very different phenomena in different countries, and I'm very aware of that, having just been in Central America as well as Mexico, and here now in Colombia. We have a lot of people in the conference. I'm out here, we work in Brazil and other places, Chile. And so we have to be very careful but it is very clear to me in the spaces I've been that there are places where criminality has connected to the possible politics of an area, connects to who governs, makes deals over who votes for whom, and although it has different manifestations, there's something going on in which criminal groups are also ordering the violence, which is what I want to put into this. Violence ordering criminal groups, actually deciding when violence is used, when it's not. And obviously part of the problem is when they compete with each other, conflict with each other. And an understanding in Latin America of the resources, the organizations of criminal groups, versus what is often the transactional politics to corrupt politics and institutions of states in the region which are not trusted. There is so little confidence. And the institution which is trusted is often the army. And this leads to all sorts of issues in the region because clearly who is the army accountable to? And the violence of the army is then seen by many as an acceptable violence, and it creates what I call authoritarian citizenship, where you prefer the army to come in to deal with the criminals or to deal with the groups that are in some way attacking you, rather than have an institutionality, a rule of law, etc. And then a very interesting study by Inside Crime at American University has drawn attention to some very important factors for understanding the logics of what's going on. On the one hand, you have to bring in those groups that are embedded in the market and in entrepreneurialism. And then there are groups that are embedded in the state and connected to the state. And then there are groups that are socially have social constituencies, and this is very important, these different networks, these different criminal networks. And I think what I like about this study is the way it helps us to think in the differences of the formations that are going on in the illicit economy, to get us to think, like I'm with the slide on the Iren, the FARC, the Camp de Golfo, and what are we actually thinking? What is political? What is not political? What is criminal? What is not criminal? Right? And how does the state get connected, and what is the relationship of people living amongst all of this? Very important, who's living amongst all of this. Next slide. So the economic, social, political, territorial and frontier logics of criminality, a huge issue, and I can't go into this in great depth, and I don't have the opportunity really to sort of nuance it at the point of to country and place, but there are some clear themes in Latin America that are absolutely essential if we're going to understand what's going on. You cannot understand what's going on unless you understand the inequality of the region, much more the inequality than the poverty. And it's very important to sort of have in mind the fact that there was a whole period, what's called the pink tide in Latin America, about 2003 to 2012, when poverty was reduced, inequality a little bit, less than poverty, but not the violence. So that's also something to get us thinking, how it's not just social programs that are going to address this. There has to be some understanding of a new economy, it seems to me, an economy which absolutely redistributes and is not embedded in this inequality. We also have the problem of low growth in Latin America. Very much a discussion I'm having here at the moment is the potential recession on the horizon, starting already, what that will mean for a region that has all these social problems and all the problems of growing criminality and illicit economies. Extractivism, I've just been with Garifuna, an indigenous people from Honduras who live in a whole area where drug trafficking is absolutely, they have to adapt, live, do what they can. They still try to keep their organizations going, but they're living also with illegal logging, illegal mining, hydroelectric dams, and in killing of Berta Cáceres, a very amazing leader. And finally, we do know that the dam, people own the dam, was involved in that. But there are these aspects of the violences that connect the illegality with what is legality, which is, I think Jeff made this point, the dam is a perfectly legal project. It was a green energy project in some way, but to do it, they had to evict people from the land, and they had to ally with all sorts of armed actors and to kill social leaders. We've got the problems deeply affecting Latin America, climate change, the global dynamics, which are obviously vital to understand. The pink tide was when there was a big commodity boom. China bought up many of the commodities of Latin America. Now what will happen, some places in Latin America have lithium, going to be much demand, but how different countries are going to have to adapt when they're still very commodity dependent is a huge issue. We then have violent rural extremism. We have rapid urbanizations. I mentioned it in the case of Medellin, but I could give you many. And then we have frustrated masculinities, a theme which doesn't often get discussed, but I feel is absolutely vital, and it's a global theme. 90% of homicides, to use that measure, in the world are committed by young men. 80% of the victims are young men. And in Latin America, a statistic came out, it was 2013, but I think it's still very relevant. There's a 1 in 50 chance of dying before you reach 31 if you're a poor young man in Latin America. That is a horrific figure, And then we've got violent history of those violent dictatorships I talked about, to the criminalized politics I've been talking about, to authoritarian citizenship. So we have logics here that are deeply dangerous, but also are reproducing the very phenomenon that we're talking about. They are part of the reproduction. And the porous and corruptible land and sea frontiers are absolutely vital to the picture as well. So here in Colombia, the Venezuelan-Colombian frontier at this moment is absolutely critical to understanding the very particular issues that are taking place between various criminal groups in Colombia and the ELN in particular, but others, and the frontier and the drugs trafficking in Venezuela. Next slide. So for a final, bringing this home, I want to talk about the region I've just come from. And again, I'm looking at the clock, I think we're still okay. Tierra Caliente, Michoacán, Mexico. I want to talk about the violences amidst mutating illegal economies and what I've just lived. Next slide. So this area, Apatzingán, is the urban center of this area of Mexico. And for a long time behind that mountain, a group of the Viagras there would be people who would go to receive justice, even women, if they're being beaten up, would go there sometimes because no one trusts the police. And I told you the story before. And the Viagras are actually a group that came out of another group, the Templarios, that were eventually defeated by self-defense groups in this region. And but Tierra Caliente has a history of all kinds of criminal logics. Next slide. So here we have Tepocatepec, and we have the area. This area was once the marijuana growing area, but since then it is an area which where different drugs have come. Next slide. In which it's an area, these are the autodefensas, where the Tepocatepec was an area where they tried to prevent the Templarios coming in. The cattle ranchers, first of all, came together to prevent the Templarios and the drug trafficking spreading to this particular municipality. They managed to defeat the drug traffickers at that particular moment through the autodefensas, but what they've had to ward off just this last couple of years is the Jalisco cartel coming in to try and take control of this corridor, and other drug trafficking groups and criminal groups have allied to stop the Jalisco. And they've also allied with the army of the state and taken on tasks that the state army you would expect to do. And that connection between who brings order, who does what, which criminal group does the state decide to deal with? This is something which is absolutely present in this area. Next slide. So this is to try and just give a sense of what this means to live amongst these competing groups in everyday terms. So what was happening while I was there was that the cost, because these groups control the various parts of the economy. They don't just drug traffic. And it's very important to understand the whole spread of different forms of illicit economy from what we know about. I'll talk a little bit more about the drugs in a minute. But the tortilla, which is the basic diet here, the price of the tortilla is the highest in almost all of Mexico because of the extortion of the quota that the drugs groups put on the food. And that's true of other foods, but it's also true of how many hours you can work in the lemon fields, because lemon still is harvested here. The lemon isn't good quality, and so the criminal groups now determine how many hours you can work and to keep the price up. And then when the young people have finished in the harvest and they come home early in the afternoon, they're nothing to do and they get recruited. And so that this is part of the whole sort of social process of recruitment that goes on. But these lorries are legal. These are legal food sellers. They take food from one place to another. But the road, which I just went on, is now controlled by many armed groups, and they will stop them and take a quota. And so the price of food goes up. And many people have to accept this because they want what I talked about earlier, a kind of tense calm. They don't want the disorder, right? This word disorder comes in so many ways. When you have, I've learned it in so many parts of Mexico, particularly Tijuana, I remember a huge issue. What really the communities hate is when the violent groups are at war with each other, because they end up in the middle, they end up losing their lives. And so this is get to have a tense calm, to have that order. It's not what people choose. And I think this is the point. That's why criminal governance for me, you know, I have to question it a little bit, because it sounds like people want this. They don't want it. They accept it, and sometimes it means it's better than the alternative. But recently there was some kidnappings just in the area where I've just been, a horrendous kidnapping where 2 of the victims and mother and daughter were killed. And eventually 3 of the kidnappers were killed, but not by the justice system. They were killed by the criminal actors in the region. Next slide. These are the lemon trolleys, which the lemon catbird vans, which I saw just to talk about that problem of the lemon growing. Next slide. So, just to finish off on the Apatingan region and to give you the 2 minutes, I just wanted to say that there is a legal economy, but basically this illegal economy has grown into it and mutated. The legal economy was at one time cotton. It was then melon, and then it's lemon. But these commodities collapsed, and marijuana grew, and then cocaine came in from Colombia, border, very important port, and then fentanyl with precursors from China. This is now the major drug that the United States wants. So this is also shifting the whole way the economy, illicit economy works. But if we don't understand that original problem of the economy that collapsed, we wouldn't understand how all these criminal actors, young people, young men have gone into this entrepreneurial in so many ways, and the violence that has accompanied that process, and how that is intersected with the politics of Michoacan and the politics of Mexico. So because you can buy votes, you can buy the police, you can actually ensure that the municipality only does what you want it to do, or doesn't go further than you want it to do. And you can also do work for the army, even though the army is supposed to be an institution of the state. In other words, the complexity, I agree it's complex, you need these 2 minutes, but it's the complexity in one place in Latin America, one region, that is so important to communicate. So I'll give you 2 minutes to think about that before we conclude. Half a minute left. Yeah, that's it, I'm afraid. Right, next slide. And we are getting to the end You know, I've got a third block, but I won't be stopping after this. I'll get to the conclusions. So let's look at this violence reproducing state, elites and transactional orders to try and get some sort of analytical clarity in a very complex situation. Next slide. So what is this state formation process? It's, we assume a global reference of Weber, but this is so non-Weberian in any sense, or it's even anti-Weberian. Violence is not monopolized, it's diffused, it becomes chronic, it's chronified. The state claims legitimacy for the violence it uses, but there is absolutely no sense of legitimacy in the violences that I've been describing to you over time and at the present. And that word legitimacy was not very deeply sort of investigated by Weber to actually was acceptance of the state's violence and the legal rules that underpin it. But there's no system of legal rules. And this is very important, or very, very uneven and very poorly implemented. Impunity reigns in many parts of Latin America. Again, I stress it's different in different places, but I can generally speaking, we can argue that the rule of law is incredibly weak in the region. And I link this to studies I've done on elites and violence, because although Europe is by not at all a model, one has to try and understand why does Europe have a homicide rate less than 2 per 100,000 on average, and Latin America 28 per 100,000 on average. Again, these averages I don't like, but anyway, they're useful to give a broad picture. But basically, if we understand over centuries, in the beginning early on, sort of with the first processes of accepting the absolutist state in Europe, the state began to accept a third party to deal with the inter-elite conflicts. And over a long period of time, that translated ultimately into something we call today the rule of law, which means that basically there is at least some sense that there's equality before the law, that there's accessibility to the rule of law, and the law works in an independent way. That can be discussed. It's not all perfect by any means, but I've come to feel that this is actually really matters to the elite, because the elites have the money to invest in this, and because if they don't invest, they have their own private security, and they have a commercial law which they can make sure works, but they don't have to do anything about this law in any other sense. So for me, the elites learn to protect their interests, and notably those what I call the oligarchic elites, after a very interesting book by Jeffrey Winters, in which the defense of wealth is the most important aspect. How do we defend wealth? Because the elites of Latin America, the oligarchic elites, very rarely get put into the question when we talk about criminality and illegality. And yet we have all sorts of very powerful elite groups, from traditional landowning sectors to much more modern financial sectors. There's almost an emerging new elite over the last decade in Latin America connected to finance. And we have in Colombia at least 2 members of the elite in the Forbes 100 list, richest. And so understanding all those logics of the elites and how that sits side by side with what we're talking about, the criminal actors, is a very important question. And sometimes those elites have been involved in direct violence. And I talked about paramilitary in Colombia, death squads in El Salvador, Guardias Blancas in Chiapas. But basically, if the elites don't want to pay taxes, it's a big issue. To get a public security sector that really reduces violence and brings in the rule of law, where feminicides take place and people know that you're going to be brought before the law. If that does not happen, then there are serious problems. And there are moments in Latin America when elites did accept that. A war tax in Colombia under President Uribe, beginning of the 2000s, but the paramilitary were heavily involved. In Monterrey, I talked to the elites there, they had invested in a Fuerza Civil, a police force, only when the violence touched them, only when they could not go to shop in Texas or go to their farms because they were afraid of kidnapping, because the Zetas had such a presence. And then I think you've got the fact that this transactional politics is so significant to understanding both the legalities of the economy and how they connect to the illegalities and the way politics works in all of this. Basically, to give an example, in Mexico, the PRI was perfectly lived side by side with drugs for a long time, and it was controlled the state in Mexico. and it was a single party controlled centralising, but a lot of transactional politics, but it controlled those transactional politics and it linked with drugs trafficking. When the PRI lost power in the 80s and there was a transition to what we call democracy, then they no longer controlled that transactional politics. It went local, and in come the legal economy to actually buy votes for politicians and to finance the buying of votes. And I think this point that violence and criminality have coexisted with democracy in Latin America as well as with dictatorship, to me, raises so many questions about the connection to politics. Next slide. And so we can reach the conclusion now, and I think we're just about on time. Yes, next slide. So what have we learned? What have we learned, right? So learning from Latin America, resetting the conversation. And as I said, I took that idea of disorder from SOAS, where we learned that drugs production does mean development for the poorest. It means more than survival. It means education, services, goods. I haven't talked about that side of the chain, the crop, the plant, the growers in Putumayo, those who actually have found that, you know, coca has meant something for them. And it raises so many questions about the drugs debate and what it means to all I've been talking about and how we can rethink that drugs debate. You know, very important. I just wanted to remind us that the growers are there as well, but that there's these illicit economies around them, the kind of frontier areas where the transactions take place, and the role of politics and the state come in so strongly to the whole, to give us the whole very complicated picture. And I haven't even talked about the way the global north interacts with this. Next slide. So while criminal violence and orders grow in interaction with state violence, and political orders, criminality, and violences are an outcome also of this. They're an outcome also of that interaction. So the very formation logics of the state within a global history and dynamic, from colonialism to neoliberalism, and the current crisis of neoliberalism within a shifting geopolitics, these are factors we've got to take into account. And you look at the entire picture in Latin America, it's clear that action at multiple levels is needed to interrupt intergenerational cycles of violence. Those young men that I talked about, right, who grew up in families of violence, who grew up in families where their sense of their future is, I'll live for 30, I'll live till I'm 30. And I've talked to some of these guys, right, and one said, oh, at least I'm now 33. But they don't imagine they're going to live longer. And so, okay, I can have the girls, I can have money, I can, leave 2 children on the planet, and I'll die. That is not a way to build a country. That is not a way to build, to develop a country for everybody, for everybody's rights. And so how do you interrupt those intergenerational cycles to give people a long-term sense of their future, to enable agency that can contribute to rethinking the state as a source of vital public goods, such as security and the rule of law, to provide human security as an integral vision aimed at reducing violences, to open up spaces for participation on the conditions of inequality exclusion that generate violences and criminality. So what I'm saying is, the politics of social justice are absolutely central, but they're not enough. And so we have to start putting violences and criminalities into the picture so we can see how we can also open up the space to work around the criminalities and violences, and then to work on the conditions that generate them. All of this is iterative, it all takes place as part of the same picture, but we need to take all the factors into account. Next slide. So violence is in the foreground. Is it possible the politics without violence? It seems very utopian. But in fact, I actually have also learned from Latin America the incredible amount of social action on violences that take place. In Mexico, I've just been, the women's groups that have worked against feminicides, the extraordinary movements of different groups that are affected by violences in so many different ways. That's still trying to keep open that civil space. And if we don't start supporting that social action on violence and the social action to address the conditions that promote violence, we will end up with something which I quote here. I'm always very careful as a political scientist who works as an anthropologist, not always to quote taxi drivers, obviously, but often I give you insights. I have lots of conversations with people. And just now, I was with a taxi driver in Morelia who says politics is a business, right? Didn't trust any of the institutions. And then I was with another taxi driver, not long ago in Guatemala, who said, we need a Kelly in Guatemala. That sense that you can actually use violence to actually deal with all the social problems is, for me, one of the most worrying issues we can face. A good friend of mine, Adrian Bergman, living in El Salvador, just told me that recently that they destroyed, Kelly got them to destroy the tombs of of pandillas, of gang members in El Salvador. No? So to give the message that you cannot be a gang member. Next slide. So Luis Alberto Moreno, Foreign Affairs, who's former head of the IDB, I've got this is the penultimate slide to be pleased to know. The idea of a stagnant region awash in street protests, political instability, and organised crime is not some nightmarish vision of a lost decade ahead. It is the reality many Latin American countries are now facing. Next slide. Yeah, as I said, I don't normally put myself into the picture, but I just wanted to not leave this on a negative note. I've already said about the number of people working to act on social violences of all kinds, but I also wanted to mention people in the middle of these criminalities. So this is where I've just been, in Buena Vista, Tierra Caliente. And these people are trying in the midst, I mean, there have been 7 assassinations of municipal presidents or the mayors in this particular municipality. To actually live amongst this and to try and really build possibilities with people to start talking about violence, to start talking about education, to start talking about reducing violences, start helping young people to go to have sports, to look at the role of women and what's going on with women's lives. All of this they're currently trying to do in this particular place in Apatzingán. I wanted, Buena Vista, I wanted to just leave this note because there is action going on in Latin America, and that action needs support. And Latin America is one of the most creative places for social action. I've learned so much from the region all my life. So although the picture is very complex and very difficult, I think we also need to look at the actors in the midst of it who are trying to do something about the situation and think of a new way of imagining the state and the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Hold on here. I just need to make sure that I am unmuted. And as we're close to time here, I'm going to jump right into the questions. And we've already had a few questions in the chat. And I would encourage you, if you have a question, to go ahead and put your question in the chat. You can send it to everyone, or you can send it to me privately if you want to, Jeff Garmany. You can send it directly that way. Or actually, if you'd like to ask a question live, you can also raise your hand using that sort of the raise hand feature, and we can call on you that way too. But there's already a number of questions in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and read some of these to Jenny. If I'm not mistaken, Jenny can actually not see the chat because she's on a tablet. So I will go ahead and read these out to a few of these to Jenny, and she can get started on this first wave of questions. And that gives anyone else who wants to ask a question time to go ahead and put your question in the chat. So, Jenny, okay for you if I get going on these questions?
Yes, please do. I'm just searching for a pen so that I can write, but carry on.
All right, off we go then. So the first one actually comes in from Benjamin, and it is, to what extent, actually, I'm sorry, this is the second question. The first one is, we've looked at a lot of the cases in countries in Central and Latin America where transactional politics and the institution of violence and criminality is low. In other words, we've heard about all the bad cases. What are some virtuous ones or some good ones, some counterexamples, so to speak? And then a second question also from Benjamin here, to what extent is the framework that's been presented here, how can it be extended globally to other regions, particularly in this case, in this question, to sub-Saharan Africa? Perhaps not necessarily your region of expertise, but just curious your thoughts on that. Another question here from Jonathan, actually. Thank you, Jenny. What can we learn from this experience in Latin America in relation to contemporary processes of state building elsewhere, especially, for example, in advanced, quote unquote, advanced Western democracies? The links between elite politics, democracy, and corruption in some respects don't seem to be so different. though clearly the level of violence is substantially different. So again, sort of what lessons can we take from your talk today to apply them to countries in the global north, for example? And then finally, another question right here, and this is from Camilo. Why do you think, this is a broader question, why do you think that the Weberian definition of the state became the universal standard? And I think here specifically we're talking about this sort of this monopoly on violence as kind of the definition for the state. And as there's no more coming in right now, I'll go ahead and sort of ask a quick question as well too. Want to give you some time to think about. And actually, it's a methodological question. It's the issues that you've talked about here, questions of violence, particularly state violence, but the sort of the intimate forms of violence as well. These are difficult issues to research. And I think it's one of the reasons why they tend to get overlooked. It's not just that it's hard to account for in terms of quantitative factors. It's difficult and dangerous to research these issues. So I'm curious, in your experience, what sorts of methodological insights do you have for studying these kinds of issues in ways that not only sort of keep yourself safe, but also keep the people that you're working with safe and potentially foster, you know, higher levels of peace, which I know you're interested in? So that would be sort of my question for you here. That's a heavy load to begin with.
Great. Well, great questions. So in terms of the low crime and violence cases, it's a very important question because clearly there are places, it is a very panorama in Latin America, and we have to take, for instance, Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica, they historically had less violences. Argentina, although it has a long history of political violence, it has less histories of criminal violence, but it's growing. And so what can we learn? To be honest, even those places I talked about are suffering now from the growth of criminalities. So although they've got different histories, I mean, Costa Rica, for instance, has a different history of land ownership and land colonization, and it also abolished its army, right, at one point in the middle of last century. And it has had, again, linking with Uruguay, it has had some of a history of redistribution of social benefits. Uruguay had one of the first welfare states in the world under Bagismo at the beginning of last century. But Uruguay had a military dictatorship, which I began my whole work studying, in fact. So I looked at precisely what brings the military in when you've had a history of redistribution. And what was interesting about the Uruguayan case is, again, global factors come in here, because Uruguay's redistribution was very much due to the fact that it produced a product that was in great demand. Wool, meat, corned beef comes from Uruguay, that was used for armies. And after the end of the South Korean War, it was no longer available, and you had a greater polarization of society. And so these factors play a role, right? I obviously can't go into a huge amount of detail. Really different elite politics at the end of the 19th century, which is very interesting, which led to sort of pacts, if you like, and to some extent those pacts were able to sort of reduce the levels of violence. But we know Chile had a coup in 1973 when against a left president who precisely tried to bring in real reforms. And what Pinochet did was, I think, to bring about a modernization of capitalism in Chile. And he did it from above with great violence, right? And then we've had a neoliberal project in Chile. And what's happening now in Chile is a left government, a very young government, but I've just been there not long ago. We had a huge problem of now timber smuggling in the south of the country, where some of the Mapuche indigenous live, and the drug traffickers coming in. And I would say that the Chilean government is also trying to find a new way of dealing with security, a new approach. So although it measured in homicide, it's nothing like the problem that I've been talking about in Mexico and Colombia, the problems are still high, right? And I think that's one thing. But I want to also bring in very quickly another issue, which is that there are also lots of experiments in Latin America, even in those countries of really difficult levels of criminality and violences. And I mentioned, obviously, some of the things that were being done politically, but also there's a police force in Neza Battle in Estado de Mexico, which for 15 years has worked on how to do policing to protect communities. And they're working in one of the most violent criminal areas of Mexico. And so what I wanted to say by this as well is that there are low cases, but they're not to be made, we can't be complacent about anywhere, because the mutating logics of criminality spread the frontier areas. The area around Paraguay, Brazil, I haven't mentioned those, but that Paraguay, Brazil, Bolivia frontier is absolutely vital for the export of contraband of all kinds, and also of cocaine to Europe and elsewhere. And so I mentioned some of the high profile cases, but we can't ignore the low profile. And although there's some with histories of dealing with this process better, they're not entirely immune. And so we need to learn. And so that, I suppose, brings me to the question around sub-Saharan Africa, which isn't a region I know. But I think, first of all, what I might say is that in situations of climate change and situations of histories of violence, and histories also of people just desperate to find a dignified life. And we know there's been huge migration from sub-Saharan Africa through Libya, people crossing the Mediterranean. I think a big warning for us is how all these issues connect to trafficking, right? And how what's happened to migrants from sub-Saharan Africa in Libya. And then when they try to come into Europe, what happens? I can't believe that Europe, the region which is supposed to be the most humanitarian, actually has let 10,000 migrants die in the Mediterranean. So for me, okay, that goes apparently, of course, I'm not talking about criminal actors in Latin America, but actually the export of drugs to Africa is actually a pretty strong, it's an entrepot but it's not just that, it's about how people search for dignified lives and how drugs provides this, and the illegality of drugs brings in the violences, and how, if you want to survive in climate change, you have to find a new form of life, and how criminal groups end up taking advantage of that. I put violence in the foreground because I think who survives climate change will be decided by violence. If we don't put violence in the foreground and start to understand it better, and we do understand it better, we could address it if we wanted. That for me is a very important point. And then I think these issues about elite politics, corruption in the global north, and how we should understand we need to connect to the global north, what's going on in the global south. This is an interconnected world, and we cannot afford to ignore what is going on. I think this is a message that we all have to take into account. What happens, I live in the north of England, and what's happening with the drugs trade is affecting the north of England, right? And it affects London, but we now know in England we talk about county lines. And what do I find when I actually work as much as I can in my own country as well, I find young kids being drawn into this as much as they are in Latin America, in the sense that those who are kind of very much racist issues in London, black kids who get drawn into this because they've been abused and ignored and vilified for so long. This is a way of finding a sense of self, is getting into the drugs trade, but they are used by other actors, by organised criminal actors. And when I asked the chief of police in the north of London, a place in the north of England recently, how we distinguish between the gangs and the young kids who get drawn in and the bigger groups, he said, money, economy. And that links to that insight crime, the University of America's understanding and typology, where we differentiate the economic groups, right, from those who are motivated by the Jaliscos, the cartels, the Sinaloas. We can from the pandillas of Salvador, who are involved in some way, but not nothing like the same way. And if we try to sort of get that clarified, I think it would be very important, because we are all affected by this. And if the global south does not find its way to a real possibility of socially just economic and climate relevant development, the world will suffer. And so this matters to all of us. And then very interesting issue on the Weberian. Why did it become the state definition? Obviously, Weber himself was writing at a particular time in history and a particular place. Hobbes wrote his understanding that violence needs a state of Leviathan, because we're always going to be violent, right? And it was the only way to become industrious and prosperous if the state monopolized it, right? He was writing at the end of the English Civil War. Weber was writing, right, at the end of the First World War. And it's not by chance that those European histories of violence and warfare led to great sociologists coming up with, well, you know, let's accept politics will always be imbued by violence. That was his lecture. I published the book in 2020, a year late actually, from the lecture that Weber gave in 1919, Politics as Vocation. Politics will always have to do with violence, he said, right? Politicians just have to face it. And he was trying to deal with people on the left who wanted to think differently, right? But you know, essentially Weber had become a liberal and was looking for some way forward. It's very convincing. Oh, yes, if the state monopolises it. But it's led us to think violence from the state is justified because it comes from the state. Don't think, what does the state do in prisons? What does with prisoners? What does the state do? What are the violences that are reproduced by action in the state, even in the global north, even though it's much wider in the global south? People will say, oh, well, the state monopolised in the global south, but it doesn't monopolise, it reproduces. And I don't think monopolisation is the word we want. We want reduced violence, to bring violence into the centre so that the public policies are about dignified lives. They're about understanding the trauma that you feel you live if you don't get love from your parents or you have a bereavement. The mental health issues we now talk about in the global north, that to me is a great progress. We are finally naming the challenge of people's mental illnesses that come sometimes from violences, but also from other factors. But a lot, we now know from psychologists, the effect of trauma, attachment theory that has given us, we know so much. So my argument is that we could think of a violence reducing state in a different way, a state that looks after. And an economy, there's a wonderful thinker here in Mexico who has the idea, she worked in Ciudad Juarez, an extremely violent area. She had the idea of an economy de cuidado, a care economy based on care. Right, so it feels to me that we could rethink that Weberian logic, and we have the means to do so. And then finally, the methodological question, which haunts me all the time. For me, whatever I do cannot harm anybody I'm with, right? So, you know, as much as I want to understand things, you know, I know that my life could be, you know, it could be dangerous for me, but they will not be anything like the dangerous people I'm talking to and being with. So it's the big issue, and we have security protocols. We try and ensure everyone always knows where someone is. We always make sure people know what we're trying to do. I do a lot of participatory research in violent areas. We co-constructed agendas of human security in the midst of these violent areas I've been working in. And we work with a team where we, you know, trying to have methodologies where we would put the security of the people we work with at the centre. We had a special app, in fact. We had a special app, emergency app, to make sure that we could communicate with everybody all the time. You can never 100% guarantee, right? And I suppose what I need to say is I will never risk anybody's lives at all. I don't want to risk my own either, but I will never risk anybody else's. But to be honest, it's getting under the skin of what's going on that helps you understand the complexity, that no ways of understanding these problems will work unless you have a sense of the difference in different locations, different places, the different armed groups that are working, the different ways people are actually acting. You need to know that from the ground, from bottom up.
Cool. Thank you so much, Jenny. We have, you know, we're almost out of time, but there is one more question that came in. So if it's all right, we'll take just one more question. And in fact, you've already sort of spoken to this question. So it's actually just asking you to elaborate a little bit more when you were getting into the discussion of sort of Weberian definitions of the state. And this question is some really interesting comparisons which could be made with the UK in this particular case, particularly when we think about state institutions like the Met Police and other forces around the country. And here I, for example, would mention private security providers like G4S. I mean, these are also, I think, important sorts of institutions to take into account. Hence, minority communities are losing faith in the police, et cetera. We're also seeing, and this is something you mentioned, Jenny, we're also seeing an increase in violent crime and deaths related to drug gangs in cities in the north of the UK. And I think, you know, the question here is, what should state actors, particularly in the British context, be doing to address these issues? You've spoken, I think, more specifically about Latin America, but is there anything that you've seen or ideas, perhaps lessons that we could learn from Latin America, or perhaps, you know, significant contextual differences in the UK that we should account for when thinking about what the state might be able to do to help this in the British context?
Yes, well, it's a great question, in fact, and very relevant to things. I actually took the police from Bradford to Medellin on an exchange process for 4 years at the beginning of the 2000s. And the reason I did it was because I felt it was incredibly important, because we just had a riot in Bradford in 2001. But part of the problem was because 20% of the population of Bradford is from Pakistan, Asian origin, and they felt they didn't belong. They were, victims of racism, that they'd come to work in our textile industry, and then the textile industry collapsed, and then the kids didn't know where they were not accepted by our society, not accepted by, not feeling totally comfortable going back to Pakistan, and then the far right comes in to demonstrate against them. Their demonstration is banned. The kids come into the centre to market, and then police say, "Oh, we're all right, far right are not here," but they identify someone on the far right, and then there's a riot. And then there's problems of kids getting into heroin and drugs in the city. And so the idea, this is 20 years ago, but the idea I think is still relevant, because the idea was to take the police to Bradford so they would understand. If you don't intervene in time in the right way to work with kids, right, you will have what's happened in Medellin, which is I had in which the ratio between men to women changed 5 in favour of the girls, and men were killing each other. And so obviously weapons is a big issue, but I also wanted the Medellin police to know the Bradford police went around unarmed, right? And so that meant they had to get confidence, the trust of the community. And the Bradford police had to learn to respect the kids, right? Not to treat them as criminals from day one, right? And how is it they can begin to kind of understand what many kids kind of go through at adolescence when they're trying to find themselves. And so for me, and in that private context, with lots of people involved in it from Bradford, we managed to ensure that by when another far right group came in 2011, there wasn't a riot in Bradford. And I thought, so okay, that's just one example. But for me, there's lots that the police can learn about how to treat people. We've obviously got a problem with policing in London Metropolitan Police at the moment. There's lots of issues around issues of racism, of sexism. So learning, in police itself, how, and that's true also in Latin America. And I was very amazed that a police force in Mexico, the NESA police I mentioned just a minute ago in Estado de Mexico, they now have a police person in charge of masculinities, looking at masculinity in the police force. And so, okay, this isn't about the hard crime in a sense. It's not about saying, well, what do you do when you've got hard and county lines and criminalities, but it's about saying, you can learn so much from the kind of the detail on the ground of why people get involved in these problems and these situations. How once they're involved, it's hard to get out of it. How the violence gets reproduced. In England, more by knife crime. Here in Latin America, people die by guns because they're so available. They come in from the United States, they're smuggled. There's another illicit economy. And so, we need to understand this, and we need at the end of the day to start a real debate on the depenalisation of drugs and how we are going to handle that, and how we are going to ensure that that doesn't simply make drugs a privatised industry, which has happened a bit, I think, with marijuana in the States and what that would be. How we need the state to be involved in this drugs debate in a way that does not reproduce the drug problem and the illicit crime and the violences attached to it, and the bringing in of young men to kill themselves, to die at 31 on average, one chance in 50. A horrific statistic. I have a son.
Cool. Well, thank you, Jenny. It's perhaps not the high note we were hoping to end with, but it is, I think, an honest one, particularly given the topic. I just want to thank you, first of all, and also our organizers, Kat and Karen and Jonathan, for helping to put this together today. I just want to thank everybody for being here and for your questions as well. And before we go, I'd also just like to remind everybody that the next session, which is the third in a series, will be live actually in London at SOAS, the Brunet Gallery Lecture Theatre, and this will be on the 8th of December, also at 5:30 p.m. Again, I think the link to that session has been put in the chat in case you're interested. And for those that are in London, it's a great opportunity, I think, to get together and actually discuss some of these things face to face. I sadly will not be there as I'm a long ways away, but to anyone who can make it, I wish you very well. Again, thank you all for being here today. If you will, I guess sort of join me in a virtual round of applause here for Jenny, and thank you all for being here, and we hope to see you again at the third session in just a few weeks.